So I'll be working in gouache today, and what you see before you is my usual setup when I work in this medium. It's in my studio right now, but this is pretty much how I set up when I'm outside. That's a paper palette to the right, and I put my colors out on it, and I put my painting surface either below or to the left of my palette, and it's either on my lap or on my tabouret in my studio. If I'm outside painting, I'm on a stool. But anyway, my colors today are from lower left. It's called Gray Number 1. These are Holbein gouache paints that I'm using. Burnt Sienna above that. In the upper left corner is Pure Yellow. Next to that is Alizarin Crimson. Then I have Ultramarine Blue. And I believe that's Permanent Green. Don't typically use that. I know this boat had some unique color to it, so I put some of that sort of bright green down. And to the right of that is just Permanent White. I actually work in two methods with gouache. This is what I call the wet method, which is traditional, like many painters do, paint out of the tube, and you mix right on your palette. I also work in what's called a dry method, where I actually intentionally squeeze my paints out in a paint holder, and they're allowed to dry, and you reconstitute them with water. I use different methods depending on what I'm painting. If I need a quick setup, I'll usually take my dry method outside. But when I'm feeling more painterly, I'll squeeze paint out of the tube and use it that way. The downside to it with gouache, as you may know, is it dries pretty quickly. So you sort of have to move rather quick. These paint little piles that you see here will dry in a quick amount of time, especially if you're outside. So the downside is I have to keep squeezing paint out when I'm using this method. So that's the sort of the broad brush of how I work in gouache. But I'm primarily an oil painter, and I think when I paint in gouache, I really don't think differently, other than I'm using water instead of solvent, and I might be working a little quickly because I know my paint is going to seize up if I don't get it down. But I love putting a light over a dark, which is why I love gouache, because it's very similar to oil in that regard. But the same tenets hold true for gouache painting as do oil painting. It's light over dark, thin to thick. You want to save your opaque layers for last in your highlighted areas. So yeah, it's pretty much the same in that regard. My surface, I use plenty of different surfaces when I'm painting in gouache. This happens to be Bristol Strathmore paper that is gessoed, one layer of gesso. I like the gesso because this isn't a water media paper, so as long as it's a good archival paper, if it's not receptive to water media, I'll just gesso it. And I like the fact that it allows the paint to be a little more malleable when you put it down. It moves around a little quickly. If it's just a straight absorbent watercolor paper, it soaks in a little bit more rapidly, and it's a little less pleasing to move around. So I don't always use this type of surface, but I often do. So what you see me doing here is just going after the big shapes, darker colors first. It's a fairly complicated scene, so I'm not really worried about any sort of detail at this point. I'm just seeing big masses of color and just trying to feel my way as I go through the composition. Just a little bit about the brushes I'm using. So these are all synthetic water media brushes. I think the biggest is the one I'm using right now is the 1/2-inch flat. That's my go-to brush for painting this size. And by the way, the painting is a 9x12. So that's the size I'm working on. So this brush is a 1/2-inch. It's a flat. It's what I use mostly. I'll do 90% of the painting with this brush. The others to the right, that bigger oval, is I think a 3/4-inch oval wash, it's called. And I'll do that if I want to lay in a bigger wash. I don't even think I used it on this painting. And then next to that is a small round for getting more detail. So I will I will dip into that towards the end to make some specific marks. But I've had these brushes for, a number of years, and you can see I'm not very gingerly with them. I make them do whatever I need them to do, whether scrubbing or scraping or moving backwards. They are frayed. They're not, perfect, but they do last quite a while. And of course, all I'm using is water there and paper towel. I also have down to the right there a piece of, actually it's an old credit card, which you'll see me using later on. Sometimes I like to use another tool to sort of mess things up and to allow me to get a different type of mark other than a brush. But you could probably guess, if you're an oil painter, this is pretty similar to the way you would approach an oil painting. I really do not think differently when I'm painting in gouache. I do like to use it a lot in plein air when I do a lot of plein air work, and oftentimes I'll be taking my gouache set outside. It's just so easy to transport. When I travel abroad, this is usually what I take, and sometimes I'll just take my dry setup, and I don't even have to take any wet tubes with me. I will probably take a tube of white. That's the pigment you'll need the most when working in this medium. But it's so convenient to have in your car. I throw it on the back of my bike and travel around, and it's really, really convenient and very friendly to work with. So again, sticking to the big masses, just trying to get things blocked in, trying to avoid thinking about all the detail that I'm seeing in this scene. There was quite a bit, but I constantly have to remind myself to not even look at that stuff first. Just think of the values and try and get some of the color notes in as best I can. I tend to use a somewhat of a limited palette, both in oil and gouache. I try to keep my colors limited to maybe a split primary, sometimes even less than that. Again, it's about convenience when I go out to paint. That really what drives my setup and what I'm working in. But when I started doing plein air painting and reducing my supplies and going to a more limited palette, that's when I really fell in love with mixing color and understanding about how it all works. So I really, really enjoy that part of it when I'm painting. So I do have a few more colors out that I normally use, but for the most part, there's a good set of the primaries, maybe a secondary or two, and that's it. So you could see pretty much sticking with all of the dark masses. I'm now getting into a little bit of a color shift. I'm going to go after the top part of the boat, which I'm seeing as a cooler shadow shape. So I'm just blocking that in. So my goal with beginning a painting is to quickly, get the white covered as fast as I can. I find it really difficult to judge any sort of value situation and color note for that matter, unless all the white's gone. I sometimes work on a tinted surface. Used to do that primarily exclusively when I began painting, but I've come to really enjoy working on a white surface. I think it's another outgrowth of having done a lot of plein air work. I just got used to painting on white and didn't have a chance to prepare canvases in advance. So I know how to just let my sort of analytical approach to correcting things go until all the white's covered. But I do make that a primary goal when I'm painting, is to get that coverage as quick as possible, because then I could really sort of make some true life decisions on what needs to happen. So that's my primary focus. And painting on this of this size, within 15 minutes, I want that coverage to take place. And by the way, what you're seeing here is a little bit faster than what's actually happening. For sake of time, I actually sped up this video just a little bit. So I'm moving a little bit quicker than reality. I don't work as fast as what you're seeing here, but I do work quickly. The other thing that I think is problematic for anybody dealing with gouache, if you're trying to learn it, is the amount of water you use. I find that when I'm instructing in this medium, that is the biggest hurdle for students to get used to is, for some reason they think water, you just need a lot of it, and you really don't. You really can't tell too much from the video, but when I'm dipping in my water bucket there, I'm really not immersing the bristles too far, other than when I'm just trying to clean the brush in between like I'm doing right now. But when I'm getting some water to modulate the paint level, I'm dipping literally the corner of my brush, and that's wicking up the water just enough, just so I could introduce it into the paint bit by bit. Because if it gets too soupy, it just becomes too transparent. You may want that in the beginning, but it's a difficulty for people when they're learning it because they just get too much water in their paint. So that is the biggest hurdle. The second one is as I mentioned in the beginning, the dry time is problematic because it's very frustrating, when you're painting and your piles of paint are drying. Now that said, when it's drying on your paint surface, that's a benefit in some regard because you could go over a passage soon, the paint's dry underneath, and you can get a lot done quicker. Now you see me introducing that tool at that point. That's a great, works pretty much like a palette knife would. I do sometimes use a palette knife, but I find it easier to flip that card around. You get a long edge or a short edge, and it does the same thing. Those are, sometimes the benefit is the drying time, and sometimes it's a detriment. But it's just one of those things you get used to. I think the benefits of this media far outweigh any of the problems that you have in the beginning with trying to learn it. So if you haven't tried it, I strongly suggest you give it a try. As I mentioned, I do instruct in this medium through Winslow Art Center. I do a lot of classes. I actually have one coming up in March, I believe. Yeah, March we have a gouache class. So if you're interested and want to talk more about it, you can email me and I'll let you know. So now I'm getting into more of a nuanced, now that all the white's covered, I could really go in and start making more surgical decisions on color shifts, value shifts, and that sort of thing. So I'm thinking more and I'm painting less. I'm trying to really just hone in on some of the small details and do color adjustment at this point. One other thing with gouache, so you can see now I'm going over some previously laid down color here. So you do have to be careful. There's two types of gouache. There's the acrylic gouache, which has acrylic in it, and that's permanent. So it's going to dry and it's not going to be workable. What I work in is just the normal workable gouache. So whatever you put down could be reconstituted later. So you do have to be careful when you're painting subsequent layers, when you want to either change a color or layer another color on top of another. You have limited ability to do that. You sort of have to really be careful on the pressure that you use, the touch of your brush, how you deposit paint, particularly if it's on a surface such as this where it's the paper's sort of protected with a layer of gesso, so the paint really doesn't really absorb into much, so you could really scrub it up pretty much down to the white paper. So you do have to be careful to not let that, if you don't want, sometimes you do want to do that to correct something, but oftentimes you want to just lay another note on top of another passage or draw something on top of something behind it. So you have to do that with a little bit of care. You can't tell from the video, but the way I'm holding my brush, the pressure that I'm using on my brush has all changed. In the beginning it was very direct and aggressive and scrubby. Now it's a little more delicate, and I know I have like 1 or 2 strokes before I have to stop and get more paint, or because if I keep going over an area, it's just going to pick up what's underneath it, and might not be what I intended to do. Another thing it takes getting used to is the amount of paint you have to use to get the coverage to make it feel like a gouache painting. I think because these tubes are rather small, you may or may not know these tubes, but they're much like a watercolor tube, and they're not cheap. So you have all this money invested in these little tubes of paint, and I think that's a hindrance when people start to use this, that you do have to use a lot of paint to get coverage you need. But if you get a good quality maker, Holbein's good, Winsor Newton of course is good, just the reputable brands, the opacity and the saturation of color is going to be professional grade, and you don't really have to pick up a lot of the colored pigments. Now with the white, you probably notice that I've really, when I need to get a good sort of clean color down, I'm picking up a lot of white and mixing it with a tint of one of the saturated pigments. You do go through a lot of white, and I think that again is another hurdle that beginning students or people who are just trying this medium out, they really have to get used to just getting in there and taking up a lot of paint. It's not until you get to that point that it really starts to look like a gouache painting. Now, a note of caution here, so you don't want to, see I picked up a lot of white paint there and just introduced a little bit of yellow. That brush is really loaded. And this happens when you progress through the painting and you're getting into the light areas now. Now is when the thick paint begins. And again, you just put that down with one stroke. You have to go back and get more paint, because the moment I touch that canvas or the surface, it immediately picked up some of the stuff underneath it. So you have to be really aware of how your brush is being introduced to other colors when you're at this stage. And it's just the littlest of touches to deposit the paint in certain areas are all you need. And if you have enough paint on your brush and the water level is almost next to nothing, you really do get these beautiful impasto-like finishes on your gouache paintings. Another word of caution though, if you are using really thick gouache paint, you want to be careful that the surface you're painting on is either affixed to something permanent later, if it's a very heavily painted area, or you don't want to make sure you bend that paper. Because if you have like a big chunk of paint laid down somewhere and you bend that paper, it may crack. It probably will crack and pop off. So you want to make sure they're protected. Now, I use a lot of paint, but it's not ever been so much that that's ever really happened to me. I know it could, because on this palette, when I'm done, if these little piles of paint dry up, they just pop off. Now that's on a really slick surface, but that does happen. So that's something to be aware of. Framing is another thing. I know some people that use this medium have either fixed their surfaces with cold wax, I think is an option. There's spray fixatives, and I think all are fine. And I've seen the results on some of those, and you really can't tell the difference. It looks like if it's a matte finish, it really doesn't change the colors too much. I really haven't done that. So my finished gouache paintings, if they're presented, go under glass. I really haven't taken the leap of fixing them. I haven't done that yet. But I have seen it, and I know some artists who do that and don't put them under glass, and that works for them. So that is an option. But you do want to protect them if you're not fixing them somehow, because if this gets wet after it's dry, you run the risk of ruining a passage of paint. I'll just give a little bit of history how I started using this medium. When I was beginning to learn oil painting, this was back in the early 90s, a teacher that I studied with quite a bit, she used this material as a way to figure out compositions and studies for bigger oil paintings. She worked with it in plein air and would work out big, ideas for paintings in this method first to decide if she wanted to paint a bigger painting from it. And I was just fascinated by that process. And she encouraged us to try it, and she gave us some lessons, just very cursory on how to use this medium. And at that point, it was using the dry method. So like I explained earlier, you squeeze out your paints into a painting holder. My dry method has 24 wells, and you allow them to dry. And it's a little bit different than what you're seeing me do here. You have to really work up the paint quite a bit to get it to wake up again. And but it's pretty much the same thing once you do that. But anyway, it's I started using that medium just in the same way that she did, and that was to just do a study first, determine if I wanted to do a bigger oil painting. I just love the idea of that process. And you can imagine, gouache today is used quite readily by a lot of artists. But back in the 90s, I couldn't really, of course we didn't have the internet, but it was hard to find anybody that used the medium. It really was not used very much from anybody that I knew. But I do see more and more artists using it these days. But when I started using it, I really was not. I didn't have a lot of instruction in it. I had to figure all this stuff out mostly on my own. What worked for me, what didn't work for me, how it was different than oil, how it was similar to oil. But I just kept at it. I put it away for some, a time, and then I pull it back out and I try it again. And bit by bit, I got it to work in the manner that I thought worked best for me. And I don't work in it exclusively or all the time. Mostly in the warmer months when I'm painting outdoors is primarily when I'm using my gouache setup. So it sort of ebbs and flows over the year, but I do use it a lot, either for just doing a quick sketch of a subject, or thinking about a bigger idea, and I said, let me work it out in gouache to see if I even want to proceed to a big painting. So it not only is a great medium just for painting, but it's one of those. It's something about not investing in a canvas or oil paint. This is just paper, and you could pretty much get a good sort of rendition of what you plan to do in oil in this method with very little effort and expense. So it's really good in that regard as well. So that's sort of the back history of how I got started with this medium. So back to the painting a little bit. You can see I'm bopping back and forth between making some detail marks and some random corrections. The paint level is getting heavier. You can see I'm picking up even more paint. I'm using more of my smaller brushes at this point because I'm getting into some of the detail that I want to introduce. This scene has a lot of detail in it, so you could really take it pretty far if you want to. It's one of those personal choices, how far you want it to take that. I just want to sort of suggest some of those things that I'm seeing. I see a sparkle here, I see a line there, I see a little saturation of a dark somewhere else. So I'm sort of just responding to those little smaller, finer shapes and notes at this point. Thinking about edges, where they're soft, where they might be blurred, how to bring edges together. And by the way, that's yet another sort of thing you have to get used to in gouache. It's not quite as easy to nuance an edge to get that soft feel. you really have to work on trying to get that nuance. So in oil, you could get the transition of edges much easier because of the medium is just easier to work with. In gouache, it's a little more difficult. You could get it by adding some water between areas of color to sort of soften the edge. But I find what works best for me is to find the color in between one transition to the next, to sort of get the eye to make that color adjustment, because it dries quickly, and you do get a harder edge. So to find a softening between two values and or colors, I've tried to find something in between to sort of transition the effect. Now, I find it easier to transition with edges when I'm using either more washier areas and a paper that's more receptive to water media, like watercolor, or I often use Reeves BFK paper when I'm working in the dry method. That really allows for the paint to sort of disperse between two passages, so you do get a softer feel with your edges when you're working in that regard. So at this point, you can see I'm going back into the sky. I'm sort of lightening up certain areas, intensifying color at the top, and really laying more paint on than the initial pass, trying to get those lighter areas to have more opaque paint, get that juicy sort of paint mark quality going. And again, you have to be careful, particularly if you're going over a passage that you're color correcting. And it's really difficult if you're color correcting a light over a dark. Like if I had to paint over a big area of those dark green trees, let's say I had to take out a whole area. The better approach would be to, rather than just paint over what's there, is to reconstitute the paint passages that I'm going to remove and blot it up with some paper towel and then repaint over it. Because if I went over that with white paint, I could do that, but I run the risk of just bringing up the color underneath it, making my color a little dirtier. So it's a little harder to do that. So there's a couple ways you could correct, and if it's a major redo, the best method is to wet the surface, blot up as much as you can, and repaint it. Luckily, I didn't have to do any of that in this painting. If anything was corrected, it was small bits here or there. So if that's the case, it's certainly fine to just paint over a previously painted area. So the painting has about another 15 minutes to completion. I'll go ahead and let you enjoy the rest of the video, and I'll pop back in at the end for a couple more comments. Thank you. So here I am at the tail end of this painting, and you can see over the past 15 or minutes or so, it's been, just specific mark making, zoning in on some of the details, deciding what I want to put in, and leaving others out. Just fine tuning basically to get it to a point where I think it's at a point of completion. So I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing this for you all, and here's my email. If you need to contact me with any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Also my website, bjdellario.com. And if you're interested in the workshops I have coming up, they're at Winslow Arts Center, or email me, I could give you more specific information about those. Thank you very much.